All right, hi everyone. Welcome to our 36th seminar of the Centre of Research Excellence in Aphasia Recovery and Rehabilitation. I'm Dr. John Pearce, postdoctoral researcher at the Aphasia CRE and co-facilitator of the seminar series, along with Dr. Sonia Brownset. I'm just watching the participant numbers climb as people hit start on the webinar. So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge that this event and our participants are located on the lands of many traditional custodians within Australia, and today I'm coming to you from Boonwurrung land, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and future, and extend this respect to First Nations people joining us online. Today, we're very fortunate to be hearing from Dr. Ciara Shiggins, who's presenting on the consistent inclusion of people with aphasia across stroke research. And Ciara is a former facilitator of the seminar series, so it's really wonderful to have her back on to appear on the other side of the microphone, so to speak, about her important work. But before I formally introduce Ciara, I'm just going to cover some brief housekeeping. So if you haven't already done so, please join us as a member of the CRE community of practice, and we welcome people with aphasia, their family, friends, health professionals, researchers, organisations, and others to our community of practice. Benefits to members include a regular newsletter, updates about events and activities, contributions to research, networking opportunities, and much more. And the CRE is always looking for financial support, so if you wish to donate, please see our website for details. You can connect with us on social media via Twitter and Facebook, and we now have a blog where you can read all the latest findings and calls for participants, and you can actually subscribe to receive the blog updates through email. As always today, feel free to tweet along with today's seminar using the hashtag AphasiaCRE. And please note this seminar is being recorded for future viewing, and you can find past webinar videos on the Aphasia CRE website if you just click on the resources tab. And while you're there, please visit that page and have a look at the helpful links and downloads from the CRE. To pull out one example, you can find the therapist intervention manuals and resources from the ASK trial, which address the psychological care needs of people with aphasia after stroke. So hopefully this seminar sparks lots of questions, and you can write those questions as they come up in your head during the talk using the question and answer function on the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen. We ask you don't use the chat box because I won't be looking there. You'll be able to see questions asked by others, and you can like or upvote a question to show that those that are of most interest to the group. At the end of the seminar, at the end of the presentation, Ciara will answer as many questions as time allows. So we just ask that you reserve that space for questions rather than comments, and keep the questions brief. Okay, it's now my huge privilege to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Ciara Shiggins is a speech pathologist and postdoctoral research fellow at the Queensland Aphasia Research Centre. She's an affiliate of the Aphasia CRE and holds an honorary fellowship with the University of East Anglia. Her overarching research aim is to address and optimise the inclusion of people with aphasia across stroke rehabilitation and research to enhance their well-being. She currently leads a program of research that aims to reverse the exclusion of people with aphasia from stroke research and leads the stakeholder involvement at Quark. She's published in areas of conversation partner training, patient and public involvement, mood and wellbeing, inclusion, access and ethics. Ciara has extensive experience conducting research collaboratively with people with lived experience of stroke, including those with aphasia, and won a UEA Engagement Award for this work in 2018 and a University of Queensland Consumer and Community Involvement Award in 2022. She's developed training on topics of involvement, accessibility and inclusion for peak bodies and charities, including the Australian Stroke Foundation, and is an executive board member for the Australian Aphasia Association. So Ciara, I'll hand over to you, the screen and the microphone.
Thank you so much, John. Sorry, it's so funny hearing your bio. It goes on a bit. Now let me see, share screen. Are you seeing those all okay there?
Yep, that looks great.
Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you so much for that, John, and for that lovely introduction. I have to say it's pretty strange being on the other side of the camera, so to speak, for the CRE seminar. But I feel very fortunate to have 45 minutes today, which is such a luxury in academic world, to share a programme of research that a team and I have been working on, which is charting a path towards the consistent inclusion of people with aphasia in stroke research. I am very grateful to the CRE manager, Kelly Maskell, John Pearce, Sonia Brownset, Miranda Rose, and all of the CRE team for everything they do to make this seminar series a reality. I know that it's a lot of work. And I'd also like to thank you for the invitation and opportunity to speak today. And just a tiny bit of housekeeping. I have some QR codes through the slides. So if you like, have your phone at arm's reach for when these come up. And before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the Yugara and Turrbal people, traditional custodians of the land where I am presenting from today. And I would also like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, traditional owners of the lands where I conducted much of this work while at the Aphasia CRE and living in Melbourne. I wish to pay my respect to elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to any First Nations people on the call today. Thank you. So before you begin any journey, it's important that everyone is orientated and prepared. So I wanted to start this seminar by sharing what set me on this particular path. I have a focus throughout my research on communicatively inclusive practices, systems, and environments. And this has been motivated by living and negotiating life with my dad post-stroke. Of course, some exclusion is explicit and overt. It is clear to the person and those around them. But more often, exclusion is covert and subtle. For me, I started to understand exclusion in this way by watching firsthand the subtle barriers that a person with aphasia experiences daily in a largely communicatively inaccessible world. I saw exclusion in his healthcare when he didn't understand an instruction that he was given and ended up in critical care as a result. I saw it at his hospital visits when they would speak to me rather than him. And in the letters, applications, and calls he gave up on, and I would see them strewn across the table. I saw the impacts those barriers have on every aspect of a person, their sense of self, identity, choice, mood, and participation, and how those impacts ripple out to the ones who love them. And I became frustrated, knowing how much easier life could be, how many more activities he could participate in, and the increased levels of empowerment and choice he could have if communicatively inaccessible systems and processes were challenged, and the necessary adaptations and accommodations put in place. Sometimes exclusion isn't explicit, it's created. And when I talk about inclusion or exclusion in this talk, I want you to think about it in that wider sense. And this exclusion is happening in research too, which is unsurprising really, considering that it is such a language-loaded process, where people need to read recruitment flyers, respond to them, complete consent forms, understand interventions and complete assessments and outcome measures, understand all of the information needed to get to the right place at the right time. And then in addition to all of this, they need to have conversations, discussions, and pleasantries with unknown communication partners along the way. There are so many points along the research process where a person with aphasia may not be able to engage meaningfully, or they may just give up, excluding them from that opportunity for participation. And when people with aphasia are not supported through this research process, their rights are subtly and insidiously restricted. And overall, as Deborah Hirsch said, it denies people with aphasia the right to be heard. And not being able to be part of research also denies people with aphasia an opportunity for participation, one that they have reported that they want to be part of, as it brings them joy, increases their mood, and provides them with an opportunity for altruism. And all of this exclusion is happening despite the fact that people with aphasia make up 1/3 of the stroke population, and that stroke research informs healthcare and rehabilitation for all stroke survivors. So these data about the exclusion of people with aphasia from stroke research come from systematic reviews in distinct topic areas, which show rates of exclusion between 23 and 72%. And these are just a sample of the data. Together, these studies suggest that while some researchers intentionally exclude people with aphasia, it is actually more common for researchers to not describe research participants and their eligibility criteria adequately, leaving readers uncertain as to whether people with aphasia have been included or not. And when I said that I was doing my CRE seminar on this topic, somebody said to me, well, don't we already know that? Don't we already know that people with aphasia are excluded from stroke research? What's new in that? And what are we going to be able to learn that's new? And look, they were right. We have known for many years that people with aphasia are excluded from stroke research, in addition to so many activities in many aspects of their lives. And this topic has been the focus of many people's research and advocacy work. I am not the first to talk about this issue, and I stand on the shoulders of many giants in this area. But what is concerning is that if we map the data regarding the exclusion of people with aphasia across a timeline, is that these exclusionary practices are pretty consistent for people with aphasia, and there hasn't been much change across years. And here we are looking at about a 12-year period. And I think what we also need to consider is that people with aphasia live with a disability and are a marginalised group, and that the exclusion of marginalised groups from research is a larger issue, which has led to selection bias across our current evidence base, which then impacts policies and guidelines, which can further perpetuate exclusion. So I think we also need to question epistemology, or the creation of knowledge. As Code 1991 writes, a critical lens of epistemology says that we have been based much of our current knowledge on the ideas and works of non-marginalised groups. And Kamisha Spatz discusses how current knowledge is devoid of these marginalised voices and perspectives, which in turn creates knowledge gaps. When we create knowledge as researchers and clinicians, we need to consider who is creating knowledge and who are we creating it for? For the benefit of the populations we serve, we need a more inclusive evidence base. As Lederman and Barch say, this isn't just a milestone for marginalised groups, but for science. So when we think about exclusion of marginalised groups from research, we can learn a lot from broader literature on this topic. This broader literature has informed my thinking around the long-term impacts of exclusion, systemic barriers, perpetuating issues, that compound poor outcomes and long-term impacts. So when I started to read across this broader literature, I couldn't stop, to be honest. I found it absolutely, completely fascinating and interesting. And I was eager to map the systemic issues that could help us to make change in the area of aphasia. What I was struck most by was the common themes and threads that ran across these papers and studies. Health, social care or education outcomes are worse for these populations. Interventions or systems being used with or applied to these groups are being done so despite these groups not being included in the research that have formed that evidence base. Interventions or systems were often inappropriate, inaccessible, or invalid for these groups. There is a lag in research for these groups. Issues or poor outcomes are perpetuated. In some cases, the research itself could increase and maintain stigma and barriers for these population groups. And reasons were rarely given for exclusion. And this is not even addressing the compounding issues for those who are in the intersection of these marginalised groups, who we know have even poorer experiences and poorer outcomes. And the results in literature are similar for people with aphasia specifically. Poor or low representation of people with aphasia in stroke research means that patient samples are prone to selection bias, which leads to an inequitable stroke research evidence base and has an impact on the external validity of stroke research. Exclusion of people with aphasia has an impact on the clinical applicability of stroke research to the entire stroke population. And it impacts the implementation and generalizability of stroke research into clinical practice, which in turn has ethical implications in relation to justice and respect and the merit and integrity of the research, and has human rights issues. For example, when people with aphasia's human right to freedom of opinion and expression and the right to seek, receive and impart information and ideas of all kinds in a medium chosen by the person, when these things are not facilitated or accommodated for, their human rights are violated. And we know that people with aphasia already have poorer outcomes than those post-stroke without aphasia, including higher healthcare costs, longer stays in hospital, increased use of rehabilitation services, poorer quality of life, greater social isolation, higher incidence of depression, more need for long-term care, and a higher impact on caregivers, which, as highlighted by Brady and colleagues in 2013, means that the inverse care law is at play for people with aphasia. That is, greater exclusion from research of a population that has greater need. So it is clear that we have a problem when it comes to the exclusion of people with aphasia from stroke research, whether that exclusion is explicit or through inaccessible processes, and that this issue has been ongoing for many years. We know that this exclusion has personal, ethical, human rights impacts and implications, as well as affecting the validity of stroke research and its implementation into stroke practice. So, what are we going to do about it? So the first step was to bring together a team of multidisciplinary stroke researchers who could all bring their unique perspectives and expertise to this project, including expertise in medicine, physiotherapy, ethics, law, nursing, and speech pathology. And I'm so fortunate to have had the opportunity to work with this group. I truly am. And so off we set to chart a path towards the consistent inclusion of people with aphasia in stroke research. Now, at this stage of making the presentation, it took every tiny bit of my self-restraint not to spend an evening photoshopping the team into this picture and have us walking along this path. And I know that if I could hear the audience, that a sigh of either disappointment or relief has echoed across rooms, but I thought the better of it in the end and that I would be grown up about it. So our first step as a team was to write a position paper, which had 4 aims, but for now I'll focus on the first 2. So in this paper, we wanted to highlight this issue and the implications of excluding people with aphasia from stroke research, including many of the points that I made in the introduction today. We drew on many different sources of evidence, including ethics and law, and on the multidisciplinary knowledge and expertise of the team. We also wanted to acknowledge that there are barriers to including people with aphasia in stroke research and to provide stroke support to stroke researchers in this paper. And I'll give a little bit more information about those last 2 aims later in the presentation. But overall in this position paper, we argued that outright exclusion of a population as heterogeneous as those living with aphasia from stroke research, based purely on the diagnosis of aphasia, is rarely required. And we presented a rationale for the deliberate inclusion of people with aphasia in stroke research. We concluded this paper by saying that the inclusion of people with aphasia should be considered a standard in stroke research, irrespective of discipline, and that modifications should be made to stroke research procedures to support people with aphasia to achieve meaningful and valid inclusion. This paper has now been published and can be accessed directly through the nifty QR code on the right of your screen. So I'll just leave this here for a moment to give you an opportunity to scan it if you like, and it gives me an opportunity to have a quick drink of water. But our ultimate goal was to move towards the consistent inclusion of people with aphasia in research. We knew there was a problem. We knew this from previous data, and then we'd outlined it again in this position paper. But there's no point having a problem without moving towards the solution. So that's what we wanted to do next. And as we continued our journey and entered a new terrain, we had a pretty long road ahead of us. The track that we followed was to develop the evidence base in this area, to work with the end users of this research, which in this case were stroke researchers, explore the barriers and facilitators to including people with aphasia in research from their perspective, and then provide tools, resources, and support to stroke research. Building the evidence base through a systematic search and review, which is what we did first, was a bit tough at times and a bit of an uphill battle, particularly as it was conducted in a share house at the height of Melbourne lockdown. But when we got to the top, we were happy and we had made the journey. And I want to say a special thanks at this stage to Brooke Ryan, because there was many a time that she had to push me up that hill, and she really did carry my bag during the tough times. So thank you to Brooke. So what was this systematic search and review all about, I hear you ask? So we had evidence of the exclusion or invisibility of people with aphasia in distinct topic areas. In some cases in these data, inclusion of people with aphasia was the focus of the work, but predominantly these statistics were collected when conducting a review on a different topic. So for example, in 2018, Caroline Baker had done a systematic review looking at interventions that could either treat or prevent depression for people with aphasia post-stroke. And it was while doing that review that she also noted the amount of studies that included or excluded people with aphasia. So we wanted to build on this preliminary evidence by conducting an in-depth review of the current state of inclusion of people with aphasia across stroke research. By investigating and describing the extent and specific nature of this problem across topics, so not just in those distinct areas, but across topics, across disciplines, and across the continuum of stroke care. We also wanted to detail how stroke researchers supported the inclusion of people with aphasia through various adaptations and accommodations to the research process. So our specific aims were to investigate and describe if aphasia or related terms were referred to in stroke trial articles or supplementary files. We wanted to look at the rate of inclusion or exclusion of people with aphasia in those trials. We wanted to look at the eligibility criteria, the consent procedures reported in stroke trials, and then we wanted to look at adaptations made to any aspect of the research process that could support the inclusion of people with aphasia, including adaptations to the consent procedure. And finally, we wanted to look at the attrition rate of people with aphasia from stroke research. As the goal of this review was to provide a detailed, in-depth snapshot of the state of inclusion in contemporary trials, we refined this review period to a single year, and that was 2019. And we included all stroke-related randomized control trials. As we acknowledge that completed RCTs may have been conceptualized or completed many years prior to publication, we also wanted to include RCT protocols. And so we ended up with 273 randomized control trials in this systematic search and review that were included. 216 of these were completed RCTs and 57 were RCT protocols. We extracted data from all of these RCTs related to the aims that I've just described. And then I went about one of my favorite activities of all time, which is organization and color coding, to end up with a spreadsheet that looked a little bit like this. So now to the results. So we ended up with studies that were from 37 lead countries, and these represented 5 continents. So there was a good spread of studies from across the world. We also had a good spread of primary intervening disciplines. So we noted what was the discipline that conducted or led that research. And so these included alternative therapies, medicine and pharmacy. We had mixed intervening disciplines, occupational therapy, physiotherapy, psychology, speech and language therapy. And then there was 5 papers where it was unclear, where we couldn't decipher who the lead intervening discipline were. And medicine and pharmacy and physiotherapy were really leading the race there in the stroke RCTs that were published in 2019. We then wanted to see, where did these studies relate to across the continuum of stroke care? And we categorized these according to the Julie Bernhardt et al. 2017 agreed definitions paper. And we can see here that we also had quite a good spread from studies that were conducted in hyperacute right through to chronic stroke. And chronic stroke was where most of the studies were actually focused. Okay, so now we've got the results relating to the inclusion of people with aphasia and in these stroke trials. So we start first with the references to aphasia. So just a little over the third of the studies use the term aphasia or dysphagia in the article or supplementary files. And I know that dysphagia is an outdated term, but we wanted to include that as well when we were looking at the studies, just to see if that was mentioned in lieu of the word aphasia. 44.7% of studies didn't mention aphasia or dysphagia at all. So nearly half of the studies didn't mention it at all. And then 19% of the studies, aphasia or dysphagia was not stated in the article, but reference was made to speech, language, communication, or cognition, or an ambiguous statement was included in the eligibility criteria, which could potentially relate to people with aphasia. So, for example, in one study, they said that they would exclude people if they had difficulty in understanding or executing commands. And in another study, they said that they would exclude people if they had an inability to complete the scale evaluation due to communication or cognitive difficulties. And as some of us would know, these terms and these different things in the eligibility criteria could potentially relate to people with aphasia. And then when we look at the rates of inclusion of people with aphasia within completed stroke RCTs, we said that a study included people with aphasia if we could ascertain the number of people with aphasia that were included in that study, and that was stated in the article. So 6.5% of included studies included people with aphasia. And then 4.6% of these completed RCTs excluded people with aphasia. But nearly 90% of the studies, it was unclear if people with aphasia were included or not. So we don't know if the findings from these studies, these stroke RCTs, apply to people with aphasia. So I'm just going to give you a second to think about that. Across all of those studies, only 6.5% included people with aphasia. And then we look at the rates of inclusion for stroke stroke RCT protocols. And in these, we said that the stroke RCT protocol would include people with aphasia if they said that they intended to include people with aphasia in their eligibility criteria. And in this context, 30% of the study said that they intended to include people with aphasia. 11% of the studies said that they intended to exclude people with aphasia. And 59% of the studies, it was unclear if people were going to include people with aphasia or not. So as you can see, RCT protocols did show higher intended levels of inclusion, which could indicate either growing awareness, confidence, and skill amongst stroke researchers related to the inclusion of people with aphasia. Or it may also indicate that while researchers may intend to include people with aphasia in their studies, they may face barriers to inclusion when the trial begins, that later leads to similar results to those seen in the completed stroke RCTs. Optimistically, We could also hypothesize that the increased rate of planned inclusion seen in the protocol publications reflects the opportunity for researchers to detail their methods more thoroughly than they can in the final publications of research findings, meaning that potentially the inclusion rates may be higher than reported in those final publications. And when we were working through our data and looking across those different studies, we also started to see a pattern where authors were excluding a subgroup of people with aphasia from their studies. So they were either people with a particular subtype or severity of aphasia. So for example, people with either global or severe aphasia, and they were stating that explicitly in the article. Or they were using an ambiguous statement in the eligibility criteria that could potentially relate to a subgroup of people with aphasia. So an example of this is that one study said that they were going to exclude people if they had an exclusive impairing of swallowing, speech, cognitive and behavioural aspects. And when we saw this, we weren't sure whether this was referring to a subgroup of people with aphasia. So for example, potentially like a global aphasia, but it wasn't too sure. So when we look across the 273 included studies in this systematic search and review, we can see that 126 studies stated partial exclusion. So they were going to either exclude a subgroup of people with aphasia or had one of these ambiguous statements in their study. 52 studies explicitly stated the subgroup of people with aphasia that would be excluded, and 74 studies used an ambiguous statement. And then we wanted to look at the reasons that authors were giving for excluding people with aphasia. So why was this actually happening? And in the studies that explicitly excluded people with aphasia, only 2 completed RCTs and only 2 RCT protocols provided a rationale for doing so. And these reasons may actually give us some insights into the potential misconceptions that stroke researchers may have relating to people with aphasia. So for example, one study said that they would exclude people with aphasia because they were incapable of understanding the instructions given by the therapists. Then when we look at the studies that did exclude a subgroup of people with aphasia, so had this partial exclusion, only 44 studies provided a rationale for doing so. And the primary reason for excluding a subgroup of people with aphasia was that they would have difficulties with communication and communicating with the therapist or understanding and following instructions. And this is quite interesting, as we know that there are many evidence-based strategies to mitigate this barrier. And then we wanted to see what methods or outcome measures were being used to determine these different subgroups of aphasia and the people that were going to be excluded. We thought that this would be particularly interesting considering that stroke RCTs often happen across sites, and we wanted to see what tools were being used to determine these groups across the sites for consistency. Only 46 of the 126 studies actually outlined how the severity or type of aphasia would be assessed or determined. And concerningly, cognitive assessments were the primary methods used. Cognitive assessments are not designed to comprehensively assess language. They do not differentially diagnose language from other cognitive impairments and often rely heavily on language skills, which can lead to an overestimation of cognitive deficits in people with aphasia. And we thought that maybe these were being used, and this might reflect the fact that cognitive status was often conflated in the included studies with language abilities. And the term cognitive abilities was used when language or communication abilities may potentially have been more appropriate. Also, I want to point out here that opinion and judgment of the clinician or investigator was the third most frequently used method to determine subgroups of aphasia. And this is also quite concerning, considering that aphasia awareness is low, even amongst healthcare professionals, and healthcare professionals report difficulties communicating with people with aphasia. So overall, we need to be using valid, reliable and appropriate methods to determine language for people with aphasia and in relation to people with aphasia. We then wanted to look at what adaptations and accommodations were being used across that research process that could support the inclusion of people with aphasia. And when we looked across the studies, only actually 70.8% of studies reported no adaptations or accommodations across any elements of the research process. So that's quite a lot of those stroke RCTs that aren't actually mentioning in their articles any accommodations or adaptations. This diagram here shows the National Health and Medical Research Council elements of the research process, where element 1 is the start of the research process when people are developing research aims and scope. And then this shows us right through to element 7, which is after the project, so after dissemination. What we can see here from this diagram is that adaptations and accommodations aren't happening at a lot of points across that research process. And in the 62 studies that did use some adaptations and accommodations, the majority of adaptations were being made at the consent stage, which is element 3 there, so the one with the 52 studies. However, the adaptation that was most frequently used was the use of proxy consent. And of course, we know that there are instances, for example, in hyperacute settings where proxy consent is most appropriate, for example, when consent needs to be obtained quickly or from an unconscious patient. However, the use of proxies should be considered carefully due to the burden that they place on the proxy themselves and the fact that many people with aphasia do not agree with proxies being used. So all practical steps and accommodations should be used to conduct the consent procedure with the person with themselves prior. So this is kind of getting us thinking about what adaptations are being used and should be the primary adaptations being used at that consent stage. So that's something to think about. And then finally, we wanted to look at those attrition rates for people with aphasia in stroke trials. We'd actually hoped to calculate the attrition rates for all the studies that included people with aphasia. However, the studies that had participants with and without aphasia only provided the number of people with aphasia that were included at randomization. Therefore, we calculated the attrition rates for the studies that included people with aphasia only. And the attrition rate was 10% prior to primary endpoint, with a range of 0 to 20%. And this attrition rate is actually similar to the attrition rate found in other stroke randomized control trials, and those rates are 2 to 7%. To summarize the systematic search and review, because I know there's an awful lot in there and I've really gone into quite a lot of detail. So I just wanted to summarize it a bit here. But overall, we can see that people with aphasia are largely invisible across stroke trials, and overall there are low inclusion rates for this population. The number of people with aphasia included in stroke trials is not consistently documented or reported. And that's why we're getting that kind of huge distribution of unclear studies. So where we don't really know whether people with aphasia are included or not. There is an absence or limited justification for excluding people with aphasia, whether this is explicit exclusion or that partial exclusion where subgroups of people with aphasia are excluded. Speech, language, communication, and cognition are often conflated. Aphasia is inadequately and inappropriately assessed to determine eligibility in stroke trials. And there is minimal application of the adaptations and accommodations required for the meaningful and valid inclusion of people with aphasia across stroke research. So, just to give you an insight into the spreadsheet, cream on the colour coding system depicts studies where we were unclear if people with aphasia had been included in the studies or not. So when we finished the systematic search and review and I was looking across these data, I scrolled through this Excel spreadsheet. And looking at this, I'm sure you can understand why I was quite upset at the end of it. I didn't want the rates of exclusion of people with aphasia to be so high. I didn't want there to be so few studies that it included people with aphasia. And I just didn't want this overall lack of clarity, but they were the data that were presented with us. So At this stage, we had the data to show that the inclusion of people with aphasia in stroke research across disciplines was in fact the road less travelled. But we were still determined to chart the path towards the consistent inclusion of people with aphasia in stroke research. So off we headed on our next step. We knew this issue was more nuanced and complex than the systematic search and review data was telling us. So we wanted to talk to stroke researchers themselves. And so our next step was to complete a qualitative study. And in this qualitative study, we wanted to better understand the perspectives of stroke researchers in relation to including people with aphasia in stroke research. We wanted to explore the facilitators of and the barriers to including people with aphasia in stroke research. And we wanted to identify what stroke researchers would want included in a package that could support them to include people with aphasia in their research. So we wanted to get about making change. We wanted to see what could help that change to happen. This study was conducted at the height of the restrictive lockdown in Melbourne. So all interviews were conducted from this incredibly high-tech interview pod, also known as the bedroom on my ironing board. So yeah, it was a very funny time to be researching, as we all know and well aware of. But for this qualitative study, we conducted semi-structured interviews with a purposive sample of stroke researchers who identified with different gender identities, had different academic levels, years of experience in research. They were conducting research in different Australian states, and they had previous experience in either including or excluding people with aphasia from that research. The topic guide was based on the behaviour change theory and the theoretical domains framework, and we analysed these data using thematic analysis. At the end, not the end of the study, but in this study, we ended up including 20 Australian stroke researchers. This was in the context of Australia, and these were Australian stroke researchers that were included in this study, I should say that. And we had a range of different disciplines that were represented in that sample. So we have just gotten to the end of analysing these results, but we're just finalising them now. So I'm going to present some preliminary results at this stage. And overall, our participants did have a knowledge of aphasia. They knew what it was and they could explain what it was. And they were overall motivated to include people with aphasia in their research studies. So that was fantastic news. But overall, there was a tension between values and pragmatics. These stroke researchers really wanted to include people with aphasia. They knew it was the right thing to do, and they knew what the consequences were of excluding people with aphasia from stroke research. But there was also a lot of pragmatics about including people with aphasia in stroke research. It takes a lot of time, you need additional resources, and it can overall have quite a lot of time and resource burden. So there was this tension between value and pragmatics, and that was really coming through across the data. And then when we want to look at the facilitators, so overall a facilitator for inclusion was that there are changing perspectives across stroke research and across research more generally in relation to the inclusion of marginalised groups in research, which is great. It is great that that's being discussed. It's great that it's a topic that's coming up across a lot of different areas. And with those changing perspectives came changing expectations amongst researchers, and that was motivating them to include people with aphasia in their research. Another facilitator was learning from speech pathologists and learning from people with aphasia themselves. So hearing speech pathologists talk at conferences, that was a real facilitator to including people with aphasia, because they were hearing about those different perspectives and what adaptations needed to be made to that research process. And they were able to learn a lot from that. Even just having researchers and clinicians talk about this openly really was driving these stroke researchers to include people with aphasia more. Training was a facilitator, whether this was explicit or through modelling. So a lot of these stroke researchers were talking about that they'd worked with speech pathologists and they saw those speech pathologists modelling aphasia inclusive research practices, using supported communication techniques, for example, or developing an aphasia-friendly consent form or information sheet. And through this modelling, they were learning how to do that themselves. So that was a real facilitator. And then that kind of more explicit work with speech pathologists as well. So having someone on their team that did have that expertise. And the more they were aware of the consequences of exclusion, the more they learned about those issues and implications, the more it motivated them to include people with aphasia. But there were also barriers to including people with aphasia in stroke research. The overarching one was the research environment and the system itself. You know, you have to get publications out and you've got to write grants, and it takes a lot of time to do that. But it also takes a lot of time to include a person with aphasia meaningfully in stroke research if you're going to be adapting the consent forms and the research process and having to do that upskilling and training. And so those researchers were weighing up what they were going to do and what was going to be rewarded most by the system. And they had to sometimes make pragmatic decisions. And those pragmatic decisions sometimes were to exclude people with aphasia, particularly if people with aphasia were only going to be a small number of the sample for their project. So if it was on a different topic, not on aphasia itself. Time was a barrier, and we see this coming through a lot of research on working with people with aphasia, whether that's in healthcare settings, and that's reflected in these data as well. Time and resources was a barrier to including people with aphasia. But there was also a lot of guilt and a lot of worry coming through from these stroke researchers. They wanted to include people with aphasia, but they were worried about doing it wrong, and they were worried about making a mistake and causing harm. And sometimes they thought that it would be easier not to do that because they didn't want to do it wrong. So they actually didn't want to cause harm in the process. And this often came through in things like consent as well. There could actually be larger repercussions if they did something wrong at that area and someone didn't have capacity consent and they hadn't judged that correctly. So there was a bit of worry and guilt that was a barrier. And then in the outcome measurement was a real barrier as well. So, when they're doing a big trial and they want their results to be consistent and they want to be able to use the same outcome measure for all the stroke survivors in their trial, there are outcome measures that aren't validated with people with aphasia and they aren't accessible for people with aphasia. And so sometimes they weren't able to include people with aphasia as a result. And another barrier was research habits and normalized practice. So if you were in a team that included people with aphasia, you were more likely to do it and bring that on. And if you were in a team that excluded people with aphasia, you were more likely to do that. So after the qualitative study, we had a little bit more light on the issues and a better understanding of how we can support stroke researchers. So what are we going to do next? We are going to develop an implementation package. And this is going to have education modules, case-based scenarios, videos, resource guidelines and materials, peer support, and consultancy. And we are extremely fortunate on this team that Amanda Elston has joined us as a speech pathology PhD candidate. And she is looking at implementation and education theories to inform this implementation package. We're going to develop that and co-develop it with stroke researchers with consultation and input from people with aphasia. Amanda will then implement the package with a stroke research team. We'll then evaluate it and scale up. But this is a huge undertaking. And we learned from the qualitative study that there are things that we can do now to address the issue of exclusion of people with aphasia from stroke research. So I invite you all to join us on this quest and join us on this journey by doing what we can do now, which is presenting at multidisciplinary conferences, working with interdisciplinary teams, supporting stroke researchers to include people with aphasia, valuing and championing our expertise, knowledge and skills. So being included, being named on that. Spent a lot of my early career having coffees with people and kind of talking informally about how to support people with aphasia to be included in studies, but not actually getting acknowledged for that. So I think we really need to value our expertise and be on those stroke teams. Advocate with and for people with aphasia, and also to be helping and supporting people with aphasia to self-advocate. And then at that system level, joining ethics boards, grant review teams, and journal editorial boards, where you'll have the power to question when exclusionary practices are happening. And at that position paper as well, we also want to provide researchers with methods to enable inclusion now. And so we have put together and collated some supplementary files. So if you go back to that position paper, scan on that, you can hit the supplementary files. And in those, we have identified the barriers to inclusion. We've outlined mitigations to these barriers. And then we've provided the currently available resources and materials that are there. And we've also collated the recommendations for developing aphasia-friendly written materials. We've got examples of participant information sheets in accessible formats and a consent form as well. So to echo Robert Frost, the next time that you find yourself in a yellow wood with two paths diverging, I hope that you take the one less traveled by, and that will make all the difference, and make all the difference to people with aphasia. So thank you so much to you all for your time and for listening to me. For the first time in my life, I think I'm only a minute over, which is quite a feat for me because I really like to talk. But thank you all so much. And thank you to everyone who has helped and supported this research. So yeah, happy to take questions, John.
Yes, look, thank you so much, Ciara. And I think you've really laid out the problem so clearly and block by block, and then also laid out the causes and the barriers and facilitators needed to go into the future. So thank you for your time on that. I'd like to say I'm in the pro Photoshop camp, particularly if you're not a good Photoshopper. I think that would have been hilarious.
Yeah, I really thought hard, John. I was like, that would be really funny after the intro, but then I was like, maybe not today.
Maybe not today.
Maybe not today.
I got to say, I really love your origin story of having someone, very close to you experience this kind of thing. Also the origin story of the ironing board desk for some of your research. I suppose I wanted to ask first, what is the reaction of people who maybe aren't in the aphasia or speech pathology discipline to these findings? Obviously, you've done some work with researchers in one of those more recent papers, but when you present the results of exclusion, what is the reaction?
Well, I think this is something, I'm a big qualitative researcher, as you know, but I think that qualitative research really does change your perspective on things. And I think when I started, finishing the systematic search and review, I was a bit like, this is awful. Like, how are people doing this? This is horrendous. La, 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 la. Got really up on my high horse, which, is we can all be inclined to do sometimes. And then we have to look at ourselves and take ourselves down. But talking to the team that I have the good fortune to work with and, working with a lot of different stroke researchers across disciplines and those qualitative interviews, I really, started to understand their perspectives a lot more. And overarchingly, they want to include people with aphasia. And I think it is just that kind of barrier that it takes quite a lot of time. And for these groups, they might be doing a study focused on upper limb, for example, and there might be only a few participants that are people with aphasia in that study. So they're kind of thinking, okay, well, are we going to give all this time to developing consent forms in different formats and changing our whole process for potentially 3 participants? Because we all know that, with recruitment, it costs time and money. And so they are making these pragmatic decisions, but I don't think they're overtly trying, or the ones people I've worked with or had experience with. It's just that there are just a lot of barriers, and those barriers are pretty systemic. And that's why I was kind of bringing in that thought about the origins or not. I think there are systemic issues that come right down from the top and trickle down to the researchers, and make it difficult sometimes for the researchers to do the thing that actually their value system and motivations, make them want to do. And I think we need to address that at all levels. So that's why kind of at that end, I was kind of thinking like we really need to get, right up to those grant bodies and those journals and advocate so that we can support our stroke colleagues. With practical tools, but also kind of by changing the system a little bit and challenging it.
Yeah.
That was a long answer.
No, that's great. It's telling actually that our top question at the moment is from Norma O'Leary, who says, would really appreciate resources and videos on how to include people with aphasia, doing interviews later this year and apprehensive regarding this. So that might have been just a few minutes before you started talking about your supplementary materials, but clearly it's a bit of a gap for people. Yeah,
and I think as well, like what I kind of reflect on is, when you're a speech pathologist, you're trained to do this. This is your skill set. And if somebody asked me to do a sit to stand task, I wouldn't be able to do it. And so, we can't really expect people that are in different disciplines to feel comfortable with knowing how to make these adaptations. So it is kind of about how to support them and making those resources available. So yeah, if you go onto those supplementary files, we collated the materials and guidance and resources that are already available, because we didn't want to delay the inclusion of people with aphasia by waiting until that implementation platform was ready. And so get on them, and they're from a wide variety of countries and different researchers. And yeah, it's great that we were able to bring those together, because people have been doing work on this for a long time in different areas.
Yep, yeah. And I'm sure that platform would be pretty welcome across the world. Yeah. Another question from Nelson Hernandez. Great presentation, Ciara, very insightful. Really interesting that adaptation and accommodation is most predominant at the consent stage, but not carrying over to other stages. Why do you think that is?
Lovely question, Nelson. I think when this idea about adaptations and accommodations need to be made kind of really started to kind of surface, I think it did happen, and the discussions happened relating to consent first and foremost. And I think that's why you're seeing in 2019 that when the adaptations are being made, that they're being made predominantly there. I think it might also be that it's an area that a lot of people are worried about. You know what I mean? Like, what if I do this wrong? What if I don't do a capacity assessment in the right way? What if I include somebody who actually didn't have the capacity to consent? And so I think it's because it's such a big issue, and it's one that, is in a lot of different ethical guidelines and, legal systems across different states. I think it's something that people have probably considered a little bit more. I also want to shout out to some colleagues in the UK, so Mark Jays and Rebecca Palmer, and they've done some beautiful work at developing the consent support tool. And so actually, I think another reason that the adaptations might, be most prominently happening there is because we have more resources to make the adaptation. So people we've got the consent support tool, but we've also had a lot more papers in that area and articles, and people are starting to share those consent forms in aphasia accessible formats, and also participant information sheets. And I know colleagues we work with, they're doing that quite readily, actually, if people want that support to be able to make those or do that. Yeah,
and it's good it's becoming the norm. As aphasia researchers, we kind of talk about, this ethics committee knows about aphasia-friendly consent, but this one doesn't, and they might freak out. This is not in legalese, So the more those tried and tested consent forms are around, hopefully the more it becomes the norm.
100%, yeah.
A question by Alan Bernstein Ellis. Within the studies that did include people with aphasia, did you notice if there was still an exclusion of people with severe aphasia, so a subgroup that gets left out even more, which is very insightful question.
Yeah, actually, this is and I don't have the exact figures right in front of me, but what I can remember off the top of my head, and I'm nearly certain this is right, is that there was 14 studies that included people with aphasia, and there was 6 of those that were focused on the topic of aphasia. And then there was 8 of those that were focused on different topics, so psychological interventions or medicine or all different things. Out of those 14, 4 of those studies did exclude a subgroup of people with aphasia. And so the inclusion of people with all types and severities of aphasia is actually lower than the figure that I included in this today. And I should say, and I maybe I forgot to say it in the presentation, but when we were looking at that partial exclusion, so when we looked across all the papers and we were seeing this pattern that subgroups of people with aphasia were being excluded, when that was the case, it was those with severe aphasia were the group that were most likely to be excluded. And I actually think I forgot to say that in the presentation. Yeah.
And it was not just based on severity, but based on something required in the study?
No, just said
because they were severe.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. So people are just saying these things in the eligibility criteria, but not saying how they're being determined or why. When it was either explicit or partial exclusion, only 4 studies said, explicitly why they were going to exclude, and then it kind of goes from there. When it was the explicit exclusion, sorry.
Yeah. I guess the problem is sometimes to an ethics committee, it makes sense on the surface to say, they can't consent or they can't understand the instructions. And so The ethics committee says, yep, sure, that makes sense to us. Whereas actually, ethically, you've kind of argued it's perhaps the other way around, to be excluding people based on pretty arbitrary kind of judgment.
Exactly. And I think there's been, and it's my opinion, but there's been things that have become quite normalized in eligibility criteria that people just say. They're just there. We're going to exclude people if they've got mental health problems or if they've got low vision. And it's like, but why? You know what I mean? When you look at it that way, you need to be kind of thinking about why those groups are being excluded. Is it because, it's actually unsafe for the intervention? Or is it because that was just normalized in eligibility criteria? So we need to be questioning
from your
that.
last trial, yeah.
Yeah, why are we just popping those things in? And I think language and communication and cognitive difficulties are things that have just been kind of normalized to be excluded.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, we might fit in 2 more questions, do you think?
Yeah, I would love to. Sorry, I could bang on about this all day, but yeah, you tell me, John.
All right, well, I better put a stop at some point, but it's pretty fascinating. The next top question is, are there any specific trainings you'd recommend for including all severity levels of aphasia, e.g. talking mats? So I'm not sure which stage of the assessment the research they're referring to, but I guess recommendations.
Ooh, this is a kind of a broad one. So I suppose because people with aphasia are such a heterogeneous group, and they can have difficulties with understanding language or spoken language, reading or writing. I think if you want to include a broad range of people with aphasia, it's about adapting your processes to be able to meet the needs of different people with aphasia. So I think from the get-go, what I'd say is look at your research process, look at it right from you're developing your aims, your consent process, your intervention, right through to the dissemination, and start to map out the points where potentially you may be creating a barrier to including people with aphasia, and then start mapping out how you can mitigate those. And I think you also need to be thinking about your written communication, so making that aphasia friendly, but your spoken communication as well, so using supportive communication techniques, and then looking at things like consent. How are you going to assess capacity? How are you going to do that consent procedure? And if you look at those supplementary files, we've broken down the barriers at those different levels and provided training. And sometimes it might be using something like an augmentative alternative communication device, or it might be using some sort of support. But I think it's kind of mapping that out throughout the process and being mindful of those barriers throughout. If you're in the UK, I've been involved in a project that's looking at the inclusion of people with cognitive and communication difficulties more broadly. It's called the Ascent Project, and the training for that is actually going to be coming out soon, and that's going to be free. But I'd also recommend looking at things like the consent support tool as well. I think that's a good piece of work. And yeah, there's loads of others that I'm probably forgetting.
Sounds like people need to follow you on Twitter and keep an eye on what you're part of. All right. Last question from Jazz Sakon. Thanks for a great presentation, Ciara and team. And this is a big picture question. Would you recommend that stroke research teams require a speech pathologist to assess for aphasia and support teams in ensuring accessibility in the research?
So does it have to be a speech pathologist?
That's the question, but that stroke research teams require, I guess, someone to do those things.
I think when you're developing a stroke, like a team for a project, you often identify like, okay, have we got someone that can do technology? Have we got someone that can do statistics? Have we got someone that do economics? And then we bring somebody onto the team for those specific skills. So I do think that if we're valuing and championing our skills, that then you should be looking to a speech pathologist to be giving advice on speech, language, and communication, because that's in the remit of our role, hey?
Right.
But I think if you're, I know loads of great researchers from different backgrounds that have range of clinical experience and have done a lot of training and upskilling and I would think that they're very competent and they've worked in that space. So I think it depends where the person is in that skill level. And I think it is advantageous though to have a speech pathologist on a team when you're designing your project. And probably overall, I would be thinking when you're doing that planning and design stage, I would also be looking to work with stroke survivors to design and develop that, because they're the experts on lived experience of stroke, and include a person with aphasia at that end, because I think then that person with aphasia themselves will be able to help with the adaptations and accommodations and looking at that process and how it may be inaccessible from the perspective of a person with aphasia. So potentially a speech pathologist, but I also really want to advocate for the experience of people with aphasia themselves as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. Some other really good questions here. So I'm going to copy them and send them to you in an email because we better stop. So thanks again, Ciara, and I'll just point to our seminar for the end of this month, because today's the 1st of March already, so we're very fortunate to be able to hear from Professor Sabine Korsten, who will be joining us in Melbourne from the Catholic University of Applied Science in Germany. Sabine will be sharing current research projects on digital networking in aphasia and biographical work in aged care facilities. So that will be on Wednesday, the 29th of March. Keep an eye on our social media and community practice for details to register. We'll see you then. Thanks again, Ciara.
Thank you so much, John. Thanks for this opportunity and for everyone's time. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.